Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to conservation and careful management of the state's forests to make them more resilient and better habitats for wildlife. ChooseWood.com.
From St. Louis Public Radio. This is St. Louis on the Air.
I'm Elaine Cha. For the last 2 decades, St. Louis's policies for public safety contained a quiet strategy for removing people from areas of the city, even banishing them from entire neighborhoods. The city's government, police, and municipal court have used the practice to target those with mental health issues or who may be homeless. According to experts in law enforcement, it's an extreme use of the law. Joining me in studio to discuss neighborhood orders of protection is Jeremy Kohler, St. Louis-based reporter for Pro-Publica. Jeremy, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me on.
Great. To begin, let's get to the basics. What is a neighborhood order of protection?
A neighborhood order of protection is a court order that can be issued either by the circuit court or the municipal court in St. Louis. And it's agreed to by the defendant as part of their plea agreement. And it's an agreement to stay out of an entire area of the city as a condition of their either release or probation on a case. And this was used by both the circuit court, which handles felonies and misdemeanors, and the municipal court, which handles infractions and violations of city ordinances, so minor infractions, for many years. But in the last probably 5 to 6 years, it's really become entirely used by the municipal court to handle really low-level offenses.
Now, is that the case for the way such orders are used outside St. Louis?
Other areas of the country, I was able to determine, have either experimented with or still currently have some method of banishing people. In Cincinnati, there was an experiment with exclusion zones where anyone with a drug conviction was ordered to stay out of the over-the-Rhine neighborhood in Cincinnati. And in 2003, the U.S. Supreme Court said that this was violated the Constitution, that this was violated people's constitutional right to intrastate travel. There are other cities that have exclusion zones, but they're like automatic zones set up in the city that it becomes part of your becomes part of your criminal case that you, as a condition of your release.
Okay,
you can't enter. But in St. Louis, it's really tailored to the defendant, and where they have allegedly offended.
Right. So it's not just the agreement part of it; it is geographically responsive, if we might use that term?
It is, and St. Louis's areas are quite large. Downtown is the area that was really by and large used for, I don't want to say the majority, but a great number of these orders. And the boundaries were set out as 14th Street in most cases on the west to the river, and Cass Avenue to Choteau on the south. So we're talking about 1.2, 1.3 square mile area.
That's quite an area. So you work now as a reporter for Pro-Publica, Jeremy, but you've been a journalist here in St. Louis for over 20 years. How did neighborhood orders of protection and the way they're used here come to your attention such that you wrote that December 2nd piece about it?
Well, right. I worked for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch from 1998 to last year and joined Pro-Publica last year. And this year, while investigating a story that I published this summer about private policing in St. Louis, I wrote 2 stories about how city neighborhoods hire extra police officers from a private policing company that employs off-duty police officers, the same police officers that the city says it doesn't have enough of. And so you have certain areas of the city that are, are chock-a-block with police officers. Well, you have other areas of the city that consultants found have comparatively fewer police officers relative to the rate of crime. And so as part of that investigation, I put in a records request to the city. There were at least a dozen police officers in command rank positions in the police department that I knew worked for the private security company. And so I wanted to see any email that they had back and forth with the company, just to see what they talk about. And one of the things they talk about is something called neighborhood orders of protection. And I saw this in emails talking about neighborhood order of protection, NOP. And I thought to myself, what is this? I've never heard of something like this before. Of course, you Google something, it's not a legal term that I ever heard of. I Googled it. It's really only come up a few times and only in a St. Louis context, not anywhere else in the country. And so I thought, what kind of dystopian thing do we have going on here that I didn't know about? And I covered criminal justice for several years at the Post-Dispatch.
Right.
So I just began to dig into neighborhood orders of protection. What is this? It just from the sound of it, it's a neighborhood trying to protect themselves from an individual. And so what could cause that to happen?
Mm-hmm. In the piece that you wrote on December 2nd, it says, few have taken the practice of neighborhood orders of protection to St. Louis's extreme. And you were just talking about the Google searching and sort of figuring out where else does this exist. It does exist in other places in different configurations, so to speak. What is it that is extreme about the way St. Louis utilizes these?
Yeah, I think it's used only in really a few, and I pointed out the places that have used it in the story. What is extreme about it is the size of the exclusion areas, and also just the arbitrariness, I think. For example, there was one gentleman who was arrested outside Enterprise Center, and so he was on the west side of 14th Street. And yet his exclusion area had 14th Street as the western boundary of his exclusion area. So he was actually arrested, not even in the area that he was ultimately excluded from. And so it just so there's the arbitrariness, and then also just when you look, I tried to find out as much as I could about the people who were getting these neighborhood orders of protection, and what their underlying charges were. They were panhandling. They were trespassing. They were infractions that you mostly see people rack up when they have no place to go.
I'm talking with Jeremy Kohler, a St. Louis-based reporter for Pro-Publica. His recent story is about how St. Louis effectively banishes people from entire neighborhoods. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to conservation and careful management of the state's forests to make them more resilient and better habitats for wildlife. ChooseWood.com.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about those who are subject to these protections of order. And your story describes several cases, including people, or involving people, that is, who are banned from entire neighborhoods, including the Central West End, and you've mentioned downtown. Can you tell us what it's like to be subject to one of these orders?
Yes, I focus on the case of Gary Accardi. Gary was a well-known panhandler downtown, and he had a neighborhood order of protection against him downtown in 2012 or 13. I knew because he had at least 5 violations of it. And there was a date in 2017 when there was an officer on a quality of life patrol downtown, and a motorist came up and said, there's some panhandlers outside the Dome. And the officer wrote in his report that he approached Gary, and Gary had a sign that said, homeless, God bless, please help. And as soon as Gary saw the officer, he ran away and said, I don't want to go back. I don't want to go back to jail. And he was arrested for panhandling, and he was booked, and he agreed to a neighborhood order of protection. And then in 2018, police officers issued him violations of the neighborhood order of protection downtown just by seeing him 17 times. As a matter of fact, between July and October of 2018, there were 17 violations. There were 2 days in which he was given violations twice, just because he was seen downtown. And Gary, a year later, was declared incompetent by a judge. He's now in the hospital, and so he has a guardian who would not allow me to speak with him. But I think Gary is kind of an example of the type of people that these orders were used against.
What could you gather from advocates for homeless people and those targeted by neighborhood orders of protection in cases that are similar to Gary? What do those advocates have to say about this practice?
That it doesn't help. That the best case scenario is that a person like Gary is going to go to a different neighborhood. It's a zero-sum game for the city. If someone's complying with the order, but they don't have their life together, they're going to be in a different neighborhood of the city, and they're going to be dealing with the police officers in that neighborhood, and potentially getting a neighborhood order of protection from a second neighborhood or a third neighborhood.
So what does the city get out of that?
Nothing. I think I would say this. It's really hard to see what the city gets out of it. I think what the police get is an automatic reason to arrest someone. The crime being just existing in the neighborhood where they've been banned. They don't have to be breaking a window or shoplifting. They just have to be there. So it gives the police officers automatic reason to arrest.
Mm-hmm. When you talk with folks critical of neighborhood orders of protection who speak with you from an expressly legal perspective, what issues do they raise?
They raise that it potentially violates the Constitution, violates people's civil rights to interstate travel, and that that if it were tested and it hasn't been tested, that there would be a good challenge to it.
Do you have any sense of why there haven't been any challenges to it thus far?
Yeah, ACLU told me that they explored a lawsuit in 2012-13, but to pursue a lawsuit, you need a client who you can find, who's willing to go forward, and that's elusive on some of these cases, and so it's hard. I think it's hard to build a case.
So what is necessary then is simply not available at this point.
I think to challenge it, you would need a client that has been harmed, and then you would have to, go forward with a lawsuit, and that client would have to be available for all kinds of depositions and.
And in the case of Gary, as you were speaking, he now has a guardian, and you cannot speak. You as a reporter cannot speak with him.
Right.
Right. So in terms of who's backing these orders, it's a bit of a mixed bag, as you found. So on one hand, there's Kim Gardner, the city's circuit attorney, who took office in 2017 and hasn't banished anyone. That's a change from her predecessor. Now, on the other hand, the city's municipal court system continued to issue protection orders, which they paused during the pandemic. And all the while, private police forces are using these orders of protection. So, where do things stand?
Right. As you mentioned, it is paused. The administrative judge from the municipal division says that they haven't issued a neighborhood order of protection since the beginning of the pandemic. But that's not because of a policy change in the city. It's because there was no in-person court. And the process requires a signature, it requires the person to be there. And so the court hasn't had the opportunity to issue a neighborhood order of protection. I did ask, is this something that you think the city should do? I mean, the city has paused. Maybe the city could walk away from it right now. No one, the city, the mayor's office, the courts, no one has said, no, we're going to stop doing this. The court has said, we're actually evaluating, what we're going to do when we reopen to in-court proceedings. And so we'll see what happens once they open the court if they continue to do this.
So if I'm understanding correctly, then what's happening now is that there isn't anything happening because of a process disruption, not because of any substantive challenge to the policy itself.
Correct. But even though they did pause on the issuing of neighborhood orders of protection, they were still the police were still citing people for violations of neighborhood orders of protection through the middle of 2021. I got the records that I used for this story at the end of 2021. So the violations continued throughout the pandemic, up almost into the point where I received the records from the city. The Board of Aldermen created neighborhood orders of protection in 2003. This is a city ordinance that's being enforced. And the new president of the board, Megan Green, says that she was aware of neighborhood orders of protection. She had received complaints about them from advocates for the homeless, and she thought that this would be something that her office might look at in terms of revisiting or possibly revoking the ordinance.
So very quickly to sort of, I guess, give us a look at what questions exist, is there maybe one question that you can describe very succinctly that was left unanswered?
Yes, and that is, did anyone ever study this? Did it work? Did it achieve the goals that the city set out to do when they passed this ordinance? There's really no evidence. When you cite someone 17 times in 6 weeks on the same ordinance, it's pretty good evidence that it's not working. So at one point, did anyone put their heads together and say, let's reevaluate what we're doing here? Is this something we want to keep doing?
With audio engineering and podcast design by Aaron Dorr.
Our production intern is Avery Rogers. Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
This episode was produced by Alex Hoyer and Danny Wissentowski.
Our podcast proudly supports St. Louis artists by using music from Life Creative Group.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations, and leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thank you.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
Support comes from Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to sustainable and sound conservation of the state's forests, which support more than 41,000 Missouri jobs, resulting in a $10 billion industry. ChooseWood.com.